Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is having a great week so far. Happy August. Can't believe it's already August. Time has really flown this summer, and we are in our final session today of our For Educators by Educators series, where we are talking about real topics that educators are facing on a daily basis in the classroom. We are so excited to have you here with us today to talk about our very last session on advancing equity in your classrooms. And we have a stellar group of Riverside Insights educators here today to really share some experiences about how they advance equity in their classrooms and any issues that are really top of mind as we're thinking about entering this new school year with how we can promote equity in our classrooms. Before we get started, wanted to quickly highlight that, as I mentioned, this is our seventh in a series of 7 For Educators by Educators conversations. And if any of these past topics have been interesting or look interesting to you and you were unable to attend our sessions, check out our Riverside Insights page and go to the Webinars and Events tab at the top, where you'll be able to see the recordings of all of our previous 6 For Educators by Educators conversations. You can also go to our YouTube channel where you'll be able to see the recordings as well. So hopefully, and be on the lookout, we'll be sending out, we're turning each of our For Educators by Educators conversations into blog posts. And so you'll be able to see, a synopsis of our conversations on the website down the road as well. So there will be plenty of opportunity to be privy to kind of some of the conversations that we've had earlier this summer, because they've been some great conversations with educators across Riverside Insights. So without further ado, would love to go ahead and get started today because this is a pretty meaty topic that we have here. And while we get started, or for us to get started, would love for the group of panelists that we have here to go ahead and introduce themselves, specifically, who you are, what you're doing now, and what your experience is in education, and why you really care about this topic. Leela, would you mind kicking it off for us?
Yeah. So I'm Leela Day. I was a former special education teacher, high school dean in Chicago, was also our special education department chair for a number of years. Right now at Riverside, I serve on our HR People Insights team. I work with managers and bring in new talent to the organization.
Thanks, Leela. Jamie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Ducette. I am the tech support manager at Riverside Insights. I actually joined the company this year back in February. I came from a high school in Brooklyn, New York. I was the 12th grade AP biology teacher, and I also was the director of operations for a few years there. So I kind of have a little bit of a different view on schools, just kind of going through the operations and logistics portion of what a school year looks like.
Amazing. And Yara, last but not least.
My name is Yara Shutter. I'm based out of Texas, San Antonio, Texas, to be exact. I have some EC experience through undergrad, but taught middle school and ended with high school, 9th grade human geography and 10th grade AP world history. I now work here in customer service, helping support teachers with their assessments.
Amazing. And I'm Anna Hausman. I'm a product marketing director here at Riverside Insights. I was previously an elementary and middle school teacher and a regional assessment director. So we've kind of have a group here that has some elementary, middle, and high school experience, some operational, some administrative experience, and we're really excited to talk about kind of what equity means to us in our classroom from our own experiences, and then some practical tips that might help advance equity in the classroom. Would love to hear from those folks who have joined us today. If you wouldn't mind dropping in the Q&A, if you have a couple of seconds, when you think of the word equity in a classroom, what does equity mean to you? When you think of the word equity in a classroom, what does equity mean to you? If you just could put your answer in the Q&A section, I would love to popcorn read some of those out loud as we start talking about this topic, because I think equity has taken, it's such a powerful word that has taken so many different meanings depending on the context in which you're talking about equity. And I think within the classroom environment, there are so many practices and systems and processes that really impact the equitable opportunities that your students have or do not have in the classroom or in the school. So would love to hear kind of from our audience what equity means to you in the classroom. And I guess to start, like, what is, to Jamie, Yara, and Leela, like, what does equity mean to you? Like, when you think about equity, what do you think about from your classroom experience? Does anyone want to kick it off?
I can kick it off. The first thing that comes to mind is really my own experience, like within the classroom, right? Like my 25 to 30 kids that I had in my classroom, how was I making sure that not only like my lessons were equitable, but like the experience that kids were having in my classroom were equitable. There were students of all different reading levels. You know, it was AP biology. There were kids who wanted to be scientists. There were kids who just were in the class because they did really well in junior year science and they got put in this class and they didn't love science. And so, you know, we also had students with different types of, you know, IEPs and 504s, and how was I making sure that I was being equitable not only to where kids are at, but also their learning needs, right? Like, was I equitable in making sure that my auditory and my visual learners were able to get what they needed out of the lesson? And, you know, some kids do better with like hands-on. How was I able to bring some sort of like project-based learning into an AP class? And just really thinking about that, because I think it's easy as a teacher to think, okay, well, personally, I'm a visual learner, so I'm gonna do this with diagrams. Well, some kids don't love a diagram, and that means nothing to them. And so how is I being equitable in all those different dynamics, and making sure that I'm reaching every student in the classroom, regardless of their kind of their background?
I think I have a similar experience to Jamie, coming from like the AP side. The charter school that I had ended teaching at promoted AP for all, right? Like trying to get that access for everybody. So I had students in there who were like really big history nerds, and I had some kids who hated history, but either way, you know, trying to make sure they have an equitable experience. And I think something else I think about when I think about the word equity are the students that you have in your classroom and their backgrounds, because it's just so different, especially at the high school level. There was so much happening in these students' lives that I think it was so important to one, know your audience and know what they're all dealing with, so that you can bring compassion to the table, because I think that's also really key part in giving an equitable experience to all of the students.
Yeah, I think for me as a special education teacher, equity is really tied to inclusion, and making sure that I have an inclusive classroom means that I'm also making sure I have an equitable classroom. And so really meeting kids where they're at, knowing what they need, and providing like the appropriate accommodations and modifications, and doing my due diligence as the adult in the room to make sure that I am creating the learning space that that kids can be successful in.
I think that's spot on. And a couple folks put their thoughts in the chat that I wanted to share out. Two in particular, Haley said that equity is not only important for us to teach, but also for educators to be self-reflective of their own knowledge, views, and backgrounds. And that's something I think we definitely want to touch on in a couple of minutes. And then Dion said that each child receives what he or she needs to be successful. Yeah, 100%. You know, and it's really interesting. I think the National Equity Project defines equity as educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. And so, you know, that involves the right instruction to meet their needs, the right social emotional support to meet their needs, the right curriculum, the right types and modalities of learning, the right environments in the classroom, and all of these different systems and processes and touch points with a student kind of feed in to provide that true personalized learning experience to meet that child's specific needs. So it's really all about like differentiating the learning environment and differentiating instruction and differentiating the support to meet that child where he or she is, and ensure that, you know, that child has what he or she needs to be able to thrive long term. It's kind of the culmination of everything we've talked about these past 6 weeks in our Phoebe discussions, right? Like, how do you build a culture of inclusion? How do you build those systems of intervention? So like how, when you think about your own classroom experience, I know you all kind of touched on this a little bit, were there specific systems and processes that you were able to implement, or that you reflect upon you wish you had implemented, that would have really been able to advance equity in the classroom? Or like, where do you see within your own classroom, equitable practices play out and impact students long term?
I think one of the things that we talked about, I taught primarily like reading and English, and so text selection was big. Thinking about choosing texts that affirm my students' identities. We wanted to make sure that we were, reading things that not only felt relevant to my students, but that they could connect with. And so part of that was sort of like that intentionality around curriculum and what we chose to put in front of students.
Yeah, I would say also just to kind of build, oh, sorry, Yara.
No, go ahead.
Just to kind of build off of what Leela said, and I think the first comment, Anna, that you read, I think you had said from Haley. I think my experience being out of the classroom and in admin, one of the biggest things I think that was really powerful and really important was like getting that sacred time with the adults in the building to really do that self-work and self-reflection and figure out what biases we were bringing into the building and what preconceived like thoughts. And we all have a past and we all bring with us what we've learned, whether it's purposeful or not, right? Like I think it kind of goes into like the intention versus impact type of thing. We can all have, I think everyone who becomes an educator has excellent intentions. That is not always the impact though. And so being really mindful about the self-reflection work, especially, the school I worked at was a charter school in Brooklyn, and it was 100% Black and brown students, and we had a very diverse staff. And so where were we having, making sure we have those conversations with our diverse staff about what we were bringing with us to the classroom to ensure that we, are reflecting on it and bringing equity. And I think making sure that we actually put time aside, because I think that was one of the things as the pandemic took off and there were just, things were crazy. That was the first thing that schools like deprioritized to make sure that we had lessons ready to go. And I think that can be really harmful to the equity of the school experience, not necessarily just in the classroom, but the entirety of the experience.
I think maybe a closing thought here. I like how Leela brought up meeting students where they're at, and I think it's maybe a phrase we hear really often in the education community that's so impactful, right? And I think a big part of equity is meeting students where they're at, especially in knowing your students. And I think in self-reflection in my career as an educator, that's one of the best things I did to ensure equity was really getting to have these personal relationships with these students and understand like all of the things that they were going through. Like when the pandemic hit, one of my best students just did not attend any of the Zoom classes. And I was like, why is this happening? And instead of just marking out, well, 0, 0, absent, I called the student up and was like, hey, what's going on? Well, the time I had my class was the time her 3 younger siblings also had their class. And she was the parent essentially of these 3 kids. And so it was so important for me to be able to like, okay, well, let me work with you so that you can figure this out so we can get through this together. That way you don't stop learning. But I feel like if you don't have those relationships, if you're not meeting those kids where they're at, you're not able to provide them with the support that they need. So understanding your audience and meeting the kids where they're at.
That's such a powerful story, Yara. And I think, really agree with that point of understanding where your kids are. Something I've been reflecting upon a lot since leaving the classroom is, did I as a teacher have the right instruments in place and assessments in place to actually understand what my kids needed and like understand what my kids where my kids actually were. I think, I taught similarly in a very low income environment that was focused 100% on passing the state test. And so all of our, metrics for academic growth and things like that were revolved around like what kids were learning on a day-to-day basis. But that didn't give me a checkpoint as to like what kids' natural innate strengths were, or like what kids' social emotional capacity and bandwidth was. And I think if I had had some tools that, like, I think just the focus on achievement growth and just the focus on social emotional learning, not social emotional learning, mastering those standardized test skills, really did create a system of inequity for so many of our students, because I just didn't have the information and the data to really understand where each of my students was and like what I needed to give them in the classroom. Jamie, you touched upon kind of being culturally, or Leila, you did too, like being culturally responsive, like taking the time to understand our own biases, our own backgrounds, like what we're bringing to the table, and checking what we need to check at the door so that we can provide the most equitable instruction possible for our students. What are some ways that you did that in the classroom? Like, how did you ensure that you were being as culturally responsive as possible to meet your student needs?
I think one of the things that was the most helpful, I mean, we did a lot of readings, but I think, to be honest with you, I think one of the most powerful things that I was able to do was I really found a cohort of people that I worked with that identified the same way that I did, that I was able to have very candid conversations with. I would actually ask a good friend of mine to come observe my classroom and check for those types of things, in addition to the rigor of my lesson, etc. But really just like being open to, it's very hard, I think, to have those conversations. Not for a lot of folks, it's not like a natural thing. It's not something they're like growing up talking about all the time. And so I think just being really open to feedback about it, and having friends kind of sit in on the class and pick up on tone and kind of the soft skills that you develop as you get older, and maybe aren't as aware of, because when you're writing a lesson plan, you're not writing in your biases, right? Like that's not, it's not a conscious thing. And so I think that was honestly the most helpful, was just like being open about it and having friends kind of come in and observe and see how those things kind of live in my class.
I think as a history teacher, this was something that was like very easily like integrated into my classroom, just because obviously so many of these topics that we cover in history classes relate back to these students in some form or fashion, right? So as you sit down and like write your lesson plans and you're thinking of like, how do I catch the students? How do I bring them in? Like, how do I make this relate to them, right? Well, how do I make this matter to them? So it's not just, page 36 of the textbook. Tying in their own experiences, letting them relate, letting them connect, letting them share their stories, share their background, really invested them so much more in their learning and their education. And I feel like that was such a seamless way to like tie their culture and their like family's experiences into what we were reading, into what we were learning. And if there was something that was like a really hot topic that everybody was like really going on, because my school is 100% minorities, we live very close to the Mexico border, like everybody in my class was predominantly Hispanic. So there was a lot when we were talking about like colonization and stuff. Like it was a very big heated topic that they were very passionate about. So like being open and having these conversations, like, yeah, let's stop here and let's keep having a conversation about it. Like, let's go further. Like, what else do you want to know about it? What else can we learn? So it was very easy to tie that into, I think, a history setting.
Yeah, I think that for my specific context, we had a lot of conversations. I had a lot of conversations with my co-teacher about like co-creating the space with students and families and parents. And so, really like like Jamie said, like making sure that I had someone to like bounce ideas off of, that I like trusted and could sort of be real with. But also being real with students that like, this is our intention. This is what we're trying to do. And I taught high school, so like they got it. They understood. Like they, you know, if you're 16, you've seen a lot, you know, and living in the city of Chicago, like you've seen a lot of things in your life. And so really it was about co-creation, not just with the adults in the building, but also like with the students together.
I think that's huge, Leila. And even though like you taught high school, I taught elementary, and that was something I still tried to do with my elementary students. And one of the tactics that I found to be really effective is, I mean, all 100% of my students were Black or brown students from the South Ward of Newark, and I was really honest and transparent with them. And sometimes I said, I don't look like you, and I know that. And so I don't know what it's like to X, Y, or Z, and can you help me learn? Or if my tone was off with a specific student, and I would trying really hard to go up and apologize and just say, I'm so sorry, I got frustrated in that moment. And like you get frustrated sometimes, so do I. And I really apologize for that tone. But I think having like someone, and even like the students would start to hold me accountable as a teacher then, because then they would start to say like, hey, you know, I was Miss K at the time, Miss K, like, you know, I think maybe you could have said that a little differently. And it was such a good learning experience of creating a classroom culture where we were all really holding each other accountable. And like the students, even the kindergartners and the, you know, the fourth graders like felt like they could say something to their teacher in a respectful way and help me grow and learn too. So I think that the student voice is so important to like help create that inclusive classroom community.
There's something that Leila also said that is really sticking with me, just not only just making it inclusive with the students, but like the families. And
Yes.
that being, you know, I think the partnership between a school, especially again from like an admin point of view, like the relationship that you build with parents and guardians, and really taking into account like what it is that they want to see, right? Like when we think about, I don't know, like back to school nights and progress report nights and those types of events, like how, you know, do you have a parent council that can help kind of build what that looks like and what that feels like? Is there, you know, space to have parents kind of be part of building the community, to make it just feel more like a community than it is just like your kids going to school? Like this is actually our space, it's our safe space, and we built it together.
Yeah,
100%.
that like taking away that like transactional model of teaching, and like making it sort of this experience for everyone.
I think that's so important. I'm working very closely with a school right now in New York that is revamping its mission statement. And when they originally wrote the mission statement, it was a top-down mission statement. Like it was a school leader, school board mission statement. And now their approach to revamping it's really powerful. They have, you know, they're doing student focus groups, parent focus groups, involved parent focus groups, parents of students who are chronically absent, like parents of the community who are not parents of the school, and just trying to get this comprehensive voice to build this mission statement from which they can really create the values and the protocols and the systems of the school that reflect that mission statement. So even thinking about, you know, something like a mission or shared culture or shared values, and like how you can get the different student and parent voices involved in developing that so that it is a co-created process and really everyone is interested in and excited about like building the same equitable environment. You know, I think that Jamie, you brought it up like during the height of COVID, it was really hard. You were so focused on so many other things in the school that were, for lack of a better term, like emergency situations, like so many days. How do you ensure that you can keep equity top of mind, even when you're running kids to a school bus or ensuring that kids get fed, like all of the urgent aspects of a daily school? How do you do that simultaneously and keep equity top of mind?
I think for that time period, like when it was, and again, this was New York City, this was an epicenter of, of it all. Equity, the way we looked at equity changed for a little bit during that time period, because it became less about, these biases that our teachers might be coming into the space with, and, kind of the details, right? Like, it became more of like, our students were losing parents, they were losing grandparents. Like, we had a student pass away. Like, we had some very traumatic things going on, and it became like, are you okay? Like, where are you? It was just a different kind of response to what we would traditionally, talk about in terms of equity. There were just, you see the counterparts, right? And like, suburban outside of New York City, all of these private white schools have access to certain technologies and, different subscriptions, things that we just didn't have. So how do we ensure that our kids are still learning, and that they are safe, and that they, have the technology that they need to learn virtually? It was just such a sudden, everyone left everything in their lockers. How do we get their things to them? There were so many layers of it that we had to really take a step back and look at what other schools in other areas were able to give, and how do we get there as well to make sure that our kids are not falling behind. And I think that's really what the focus became. It was more of a shift. It wasn't like a taking away of, we're not concerned about equity. Equity just looked different during the height of the pandemic.
I had a very similar.
I think that is.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I had a very similar experience, especially with the pandemic, where it became very clear to see this shift in equity, where there were schools on certain sides of town who, well, everybody already had iPads and everybody already had hotspots and this and that, the other, and my kids did not. And so it was a struggle of like, well, what can we do to get the technology in their hands? And like, we had a group of teachers all go out with our library cards and get hotspots like from the libraries and like deliver to them to the kids, and like, because we were able to get computers but not internet, and a lot of kids without internet. And so it was very clear to see like that big shift in, as a whole, not just a classroom, but like different areas of your local city or whatever that have more access or easier access to things that other schools don't. So I feel like that was, while it was a terrible and stressful time, right, it was a good eye opener to, are our kids having the access that they should be having, and how can we sort of move that forward? And equity, I think, like Jamie mentioned, it didn't stop, it looked different, and the things we were prioritizing were different, but still essential in creating that equitable experience.
And I think, like, to both of your points, like that to me feels like actual equity, like giving, like, oh, you don't have internet, like I'm gonna give you a hotspot, or like right, they can't meet their academic or social potential if we're like grounding that in the definition of equity without some of those tools and resources. And so I sort of think about, how we acted during the pandemic, sort of like urgently getting kids what they need. Like, could we now be urgent in other ways, like now that things have sort of died down, like what do we need to continue to be thinking about, that's a little less, all hands on deck, everyone in it, but just like, what are the day-to-day things we need to be doing?
Absolutely. And kind of as we're thinking about, because I know schools, believe it or not, are starting in some areas of the country, about to start in some areas of the country, I think it's top of mind for every educator and administrator, like how to provide the right resources, the right instruction, the right, support for each of the students in their school or in their classroom this year. If you were an administrator, if you were talking to an administrator, like what professional development would you say really helped you when you were a teacher to think about advancing equity in your classroom? Like, are there specific, like as administrators are preparing for back to school professional development and teacher training and things like that, like what what PD did you find really impactful for your own like development in advancing equity in the classroom?
I think one of them for me, and this kind of reverts kind of back to my first comment about like different learning styles, is that my experience, the school I worked at, we didn't, and this is so different from like my high school experience. My high school experience was like gen ed students and special ed students were separate. Like they were in separate spaces. And that is not at all the way that the school that I worked at runs. We actually had, learning specialists who worked with the group students, but they all went through the same professional developments. They lesson planned together. There wasn't a separation. And the way that our Dean of Special Services worked with the academic deans, like they were a team. And I think those professional developments around like how we work with co-teachers and how we modify lessons and having that perspective every single time I wrote a lesson plan of someone being like, okay, well, this student has, this written into their IEP. How are we making sure that we're modifying for them? And, thinking about, okay, this student is a hands-on learner, this student is, whatever the breakdown was, having that as like an everyday really just increase the amount of times you think about it, as opposed to like, here's my lesson plan as an afterthought, modify it. It was a together thing. And so it just becomes ingrained in the way that you write lessons and the way that you show up in the classroom when you are constantly talking about it and working on it together.
I feel like my experience is more of a grow, like something I wish that my school system might have done, like to address this a little better. We would have like quarterly, like whole group PDs with like every branch in town, essentially, of this school. And you got to choose essentially what PDs you would attend. There would be a whole bunch going on, at once, and like you got to sign up and select the ones you wanted to. And it was like, one from this box, two from that box, one from that box. Just make sure you get something done. And it always felt like even though there was always one on like inclusivity and like working through your biases and like that sort of thing, that was always the most empty one. And if people were there, it was because they had to check off a box. People were always so quick to sign up for like the instructional ones. And I feel like the emphasis wasn't really placed on those. And as a history teacher, like those were the ones I was most excited for, like that I thought brought the most value. So I think maybe as like administrators or maybe like educators who, well, everybody can speak up and raise their voice on what they need, right? But I feel like that's something that just an attitude around it holds a whole lot of weight, saying like, hey, make sure that you prioritize like going to one of these trainings. Like I want to see, report back to me, like what'd you get from that? Like, because it always felt like that was something that was kind of pushed off to the wayside and people were really excited for their content and not so much like the other stuff that they had to do per se.
Yeah, in thinking about like I'm not a school administrator, but in thinking about sort of like advice is like, if you think it's the right thing to do in August and talk about in August and September, like it's also the right thing to talk about in, November and December and February where things are really, really hard. Like just making sure that conversation is a continuous conversation throughout the year, as opposed to like we did it, like Yara said, like check the box PD at the beginning of the year because we were thinking about it. But like that is an ongoing conversation that is like weaved into the content conversations and the discipline conversations and the school, operations conversations, that like all of those things can benefit, all those conversations, those meetings, right, can benefit from a lens of equity.
Such a good point. And I think it all starts from that point of self-reflection. Like if you have the time and the space to really understand who you are, where you're coming from, why your personal story matters too, and then be able to understand like what your biases from that personal story are, like I think you will be able, I don't know, I think just like giving teachers the time and the space to actually think about who they are as individuals and like what the biases and what strengths they're bringing to the table allows the teachers then to do the work to be able to build those systems of processes and cultures of equity in their classrooms. Well, any last minute thoughts, like I can't believe we're already out of time pretty much, but like any last minute thoughts for as folks are gearing up for the school year about what equity looks like in the classroom, or any last minute, you know, thoughts that you had coming from your classroom experience about how to advance equity? I know we've talked about a lot.
I know. I'm trying to think. I think just remembering that like equity means a lot of things and that it doesn't always look a particular way. And just being open to, I think that has been the most helpful thing, is just like being really open to feedback and being clear about like, you know, with either co-teachers or just coworkers in general, like my intention is to make an equitable classroom that looks like X, Y, and Z, and really asking for feedback on that, and recognizing that it shows up very differently. I think it shows up differently in age, whether you're in elementary, middle, or high school. It shows up differently when you're, you know, talking to coworkers as opposed to kids. Like it's such a large topic that it can be a little bit daunting, I think, to really like have a conversation about. But I think just remembering it shows up differently, it means a lot of things, and any step forward is a positive step, and it's not, you know, a you did this right or you did this wrong type of thing.
I feel like self-reflection is a thing, like a common topic that we've hit on, but definitely one of the most important, I think, is, and it's something that you do naturally as an educator all the time anyway, but making sure that you reflect on these like experiences and these conversations and like other things that you can do to create a more equitable environment, and definitely understand your students and who they are and what they bring with them, and check in with them to make sure that you're giving them all that they can to succeed.
I think we ask students to do things they feel uncomfortable with all the time. And so just like, you know, if I was to think about like how I want to show up and like the types of conversations I want to have and the types of things I want to be thinking about, you know, in going into a school year, I think it's just like, you know, be okay with having that like uncomfortable conversation, or like the sort of discomfort that might come with some of the self-reflection that Jamie and Yar and Anna had been sort of alluding to.
And that is equity, Leila.
Yeah.
holding yourself to what you're going to hold kids to.
Yeah.
Spot on. Well, thank you guys for such a tremendous conversation. Sorry, I have a cough in my, getting over a cold, so I apologize for the coughing, but thank you for a tremendous conversation and for your insights and expertise. And for those who are on the call today, thank you for your engagement. We are so excited to conclude our For Educators by Educators series with 7 great sessions this summer. And like I said at the beginning, please definitely take the time, if you weren't able to join us previously, to go on our website and listen to some of our previous conversations. There's some really incredible previous educators at Riverside Insights that have so many best practices and strategies that they were able to share with you this summer. So we really hope you got something out of these conversations, and that it's something we can continue to do in the future. But with that, I'll conclude us for today, but really appreciate everyone's time here and hope you all have a great rest of your day and great start to the school year. Take care, everyone.
Bye.